So clearly your readings and some of the videos you've already watched reveal that nationalism does indeed have a dark side. And one of the better examples of this dark side of nationalism and how this ideology can be used for insidious purposes is in World War One. World War One shows how powerful nationalism can be, how essentially millions of people will willingly die or slaughter. They will either die or kill for the color of a uniform or over the color of a uniform, a patch on a sleeve, a piece of dyed fabric flowing above them. And it makes us, it's one of the reasons we were motivated to even create this course. What ideology could be powerful enough to prompt this type of behavior, to willingly gas another human being that you've never met? And this is where the dark side of nationalism really comes into play. And the nationalism during the World War I era of the 20th century, the early 20th century, uses the same methodologies of all the ideologies that we've talked about so far. It uses ritualization of behavior, a manufactured creation story. It manipulates its narratives, especially the narratives or competing narratives of other nation states. It limits exposure to other ideas. Xenophobia, obviously, is a huge part of 20th century nationalism. And the concoction of a foreign threat and other. And of course, it spreads fear. Nationalism in the 20th century is predicated on fear. Fear of this other, fear of losing one's own identity ever again, as we saw during the Atlantic Revolutionary period. This 20th century version of nationalism used storytelling classes and systems to reinforce the narrative over and over again in the modern world, through national departments of education, through the media, and of course popular events and popular culture. Some societies, of course, even in their education practices, force students, of course, to pledge allegiances to national constructs, just as one very obvious example. Moreover, when it is time to engage in conflict with competing nation states, the stories that are concocted are usually only very vague, not necessarily true. Alternative facts are not necessarily a new thing. And they contain abstract notions of what the subscriber's nation state pretends to stand for. Maybe they stand for queens. Maybe they stand for freedom. Maybe they stand for democracy. These very abstract ideas that mean something different to everybody. The key, however, is that the stakeholders for war, even in a nationalist era, are not that different than stakeholders in the ancient world. These are the people essentially at the top of the proverbial pyramids. And it is not necessarily them that are engaging in the actual wars. In fact, very rarely do they ever serve in the wars that they start. The idea is that they use nationalism and some extreme forms of nationalism, sometimes described as ultranationalism, some ultra-patriotism, to get people to willingly engage in these conflicts for them, based on the abstract ideas that the nation says that it stands for. Democracy, republicanism, freedom, yada, yada, yada. Further, nationalism in the 20th century had already spread throughout most of the globe. And while some people willingly adopted, others resisted, still others, of course, wanted it but could not have it. And that really actually, again, is what starts World War I. Most people are aware that there is a very famous assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. But what is often not told is that he was assassinated because he represented the old order and the lineage of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And he was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist that wanted an independent nation of Serbia, but had been forced, Serbia, of course, had been forced to be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire after centuries, of course, of being under the Ottoman Empire. So this desire for nationalism is what spurs the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And eventually, of course, because of the Bismarckian system, a system of alliances that you've already watched a YouTube video about, basically throws Europe into a massive war. A massive war that also is not just, of course, affecting people on the continent of Europe, a war that affects people around the globe. Europe during World War I is still a colonial power, so all of Europe's colonies are forced to contribute either manpower or resources to the war. To provide an interesting example, 1 million Indians from India served in the British military in World War I in the various theaters throughout Europe. Nationalism would also act as a motivator for subordinated peoples around the world to engage in the war or choose a side in World War I. One of the best examples of this is within the Ottoman Empire, an empire that dates all the way back to 1299, and it existed in various forms all the way up until World War I. Well, one of the things that helped the Allies eventually defeat the Ottoman Empire alongside some of its cohorts was by spreading the idea of nationalism within some of these large empires. Within the Ottoman Empire, which ethnically had been a Turkish empire that ruled over various different ethnicities, Azeris and Kurds, and most importantly, of course, for the Allied cause, Arabs, a large population that they could use to fight actually against the Ottoman Empire by promoting a new Arab nationalism. Essentially, if you help us against the Ottoman Empire, you'll be able to create a new Arab state. We'd already seen this work with two other different ethnicities or ethnic groups that had been able to separate from the Ottoman Empire. That was, of course, Greek independence in the 19th century and the aforementioned Serbian independence, which, of course, was short-lived as it was eventually absorbed into the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But this is where we get these famous stories of T.E. Lawrence, i.e. Lawrence of Arabia, going down and forming these relationships and fighting, of course, for Arab freedom and liberty and eventually Arab nationalism. We know that in reality, the Allies did not necessarily intend on keeping their word of creating a united Arab state. We actually have the Sykes-Picot Agreement that reveals to us, it was drawn up in San Remo, Italy, and it reveals to us that the French and British, even though they promised the Arabs a nation state of their own, had actually planned to carve it up and create a mandate system, more or less, to control the development of what would become the Middle East. But it didn't matter. It was the promise of a nation state that led to, of course, the Arabs fighting against the Ottoman Empire. That's just one of many examples of where nationalism played a crucial role in a different facet than what we're used to understanding when we analyze World War I. Another good example of nationalism's influence in World War I and the post-war period was the construction of new nationalism. To again cite the Serbians, after, of course, the Allies won World War I and got to dictate how the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires would either be carved up or turned into new nation states, they chose in parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire to create a new nation state by smashing together what is basically what existed until the 1990s, the country of Yugoslavia, of which multiple ethnic and religious groups were basically put together. Serbs and Croats and some Albanians and Bosnians, and again representing major religions, Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, Christians, Muslims, all basically smashed together into one nationalist identity constructed from the outside. That's a key component that we see here, is that nationalism is not always constructed from the inside by the people that want to construct their nation states. Oftentimes, nationalist constructs come from the outside by, again, these world powers drawing imaginary lines on a map and dictating that this is you, this is where you live, you must now be Yugoslavian. Essentially, deal with it. It's into this atmosphere that one of the biggest evidences of a growing and, as of 2018, permanent understanding of nationalism came into being is in the formation of the League of Nations, which basically wraps up this part one of the world wars in the 20th century. The League of Nations essentially was meant to act as a overwatching governing body, a loosely governing body, of these nation states to preserve the national sovereignty and integrity of these newly constructed entities.